Imagine a place where life hangs by a thread, where every breath could be your last. Now imagine someone there, someone you trust with your life, isn't who they claim to be. The Nightmare Maestro invites you to step into the world of the intensive care imposter, where the line between healer and harm becomes chillingly blurred. In the fluorescent-lit corridors of Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital, chaos reigned supreme. The relentless beeping of heart monitors, the hiss of ventilators, and the hurried footsteps of overworked staff created a symphony of urgency. Head nurse Sarah Lawson's eyes burned from exhaustion as she scanned the ICU, her once pristine scrubs now rumpled and stained after a grueling 16-hour shift. The staff shortage had reached a critical point. 3 nurses had called in sick, and the remaining skeleton crew was stretched to their breaking point. Patients' lives hung in the balance, and Sarah knew that one misstep, one moment of fatigue-induced error could have catastrophic consequences. As if sensing her desperation, the elevator doors slid open, revealing a tall figure in crisp blue scrubs. Dr. Michael Chen, the hospital administrator, strode purposefully towards Sarah, a look of grim determination etched on his face. "Sarah, I've found a solution," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I've managed to bring in a new doctor. He's highly qualified, top of his class at Johns Hopkins, Dr. James Morgan." Sarah's relief was palpable, but a nagging doubt tugged at the edges of her mind. "That's incredible, Dr. Chen. But how did you manage to find someone so quickly?" Chen's eyes darted away for a split second before meeting hers again. "Sometimes, Sarah, when you're desperate enough, miracles happen. Dr. Morgan will be starting immediately. Show him the ropes, will you?" As Chen turned to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The timing was too perfect, the solution too convenient. But as another code blue alarm blared through the ICU, she pushed her doubts aside. They needed all the help they could get. Little did Sarah know, her instincts were screaming a warning she couldn't yet comprehend. For in her desperation to save lives, she had just welcomed a wolf into the fold, one whose actions would soon turn their sanctuary of healing into a nightmare of deception and danger. Dr. James Morgan arrived like a whirlwind of efficiency. His presence immediately felt throughout the ICU. Tall and handsome, with piercing blue eyes and a reassuring smile, he exuded confidence and competence in equal measure. Sarah watched in awe as he effortlessly navigated the complex machinery, his fingers dancing across touch screens and adjusting settings with practiced ease. His knowledge seemed encyclopedic, rattling off obscure drug interactions and treatment protocols as if reciting from a well-worn textbook. Patients responded to his bedside manner, their anxiety visibly melting away under his calm and assured guidance. Even the most jaded members of the nursing staff found themselves impressed by Dr. Morgan's seemingly boundless energy and expertise. As the hours ticked by, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in weeks, the ICU was running smoothly, the constant state of crisis giving way to a sense of controlled urgency. Yet as she observed Dr. Morgan from across the room, a strange unease began to creep into the corners of her mind. There was something almost too perfect about him. His scrubs never seemed to wrinkle. His hair remained immaculate even after hours in the high-stress environment. And those eyes, they never seemed to show fatigue, always alert, always watching. Sarah shook her head, chastising herself for her suspicion. They had been desperate for help, and here was a doctor who exceeded all expectations. Why couldn't she just be grateful? As if sensing her gaze, Dr. Morgan turned and flashed her a brilliant smile. "Everything all right, Nurse Lawson?" he asked, his voice smooth and reassuring. Sarah forced a smile in return. "Yes, doctor. Everything's fine. But as she turned away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just lied, not just to Dr. Morgan, but to herself. Because deep down, in a place she wasn't ready to acknowledge, Sarah knew that everything was far from fine. The perfect doctor had arrived, and with him, a creeping sense of wrongness that threatened to upend everything she thought she knew about her world. As days melted into nights, the initial relief brought by Dr. Morgan's arrival began to give way to a subtle undercurrent of unease. Sarah found herself noticing small inconsistencies, tiny cracks in the facade of perfection that Dr. Morgan presented to the world. It started with a prescription. Sarah was double-checking medication orders when she noticed an unusual dosage for a common antibiotic. When she approached Dr. Morgan about it, his reaction was off. For a split second, a look of panic flashed across his face before he recovered, laughing it off as a simple typo. But Sarah had seen it, that momentary lapse in the confident persona he so carefully maintained. Then there were the inconsistencies in his stories. One day he'd mention growing up in Boston, the next he'd reference his childhood in Seattle. Small details, easily overlooked in the hustle of the ICU, but they began to accumulate in Sarah's mind like grains of sand, slowly forming a mountain of doubt. The breaking point came during a particularly challenging case. A patient was crashing, their vital signs plummeting despite the team's best efforts. Dr. Morgan took charge, barking orders and adjusting medications with his usual authority. But as Sarah watched him work, she realized something chilling. His actions didn't match his words. He was making rookie mistakes, fundamental errors that no Johns Hopkins graduate should ever make. In that moment, as alarms blared and monitors flashed urgent warnings, Sarah saw through the carefully constructed illusion. Dr. James Morgan, the perfect doctor, the miracle solution to their staffing crisis, was not who he claimed to be. The realization hit her like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and reeling. She looked around the ICU, at her colleagues who trusted this man implicitly, at the patients whose lives were quite literally in his hands. The enormity of the deception, the potential for harm, was staggering. As the crisis passed and the patient stabilized, no thanks to Dr. Morgan's fumbling attempts at treatment, Sarah knew she had to act. But how? Who would believe her accusations against the man who had seemingly saved their department from collapse? She considered going to Dr. Chen, but hesitated. The administrator had been acting strangely lately, avoiding eye contact and ducking out of conversations whenever Dr. Morgan's name came up. Sarah had initially attributed it to stress, but now she wondered if there was more to it. Had Chen noticed something off about Morgan too? Or was there a darker reason for his behavior? The ICU suddenly felt different to Sarah, transformed from a place of healing into a battleground of secrets and lies. And at the center of it all stood Dr. Morgan, his piercing blue eyes now seeming cold and calculating as they met hers across the room. In that silent exchange, Sarah realized with a chill that he knew she had seen through him. The game was on, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to piece together a plan. She couldn't confront Dr. Morgan directly, not without proof, and she couldn't risk alerting him to her suspicions any more than she already had. With trembling hands, she reached for her phone, sending a cryptic text to Dr. Chen. "We need to talk. Privately. It's about Morgan." As she waited for a response, Sarah began her own covert investigation. She stayed late, ostensibly catching up on paperwork, but her true purpose was to access Dr. Morgan's personnel file. What she found, or rather didn't find, sent a chill down her spine. The file was sparse, lacking the detailed background checks and credential verifications that were standard procedure for all new hires. Sarah's suspicions deepened when she overheard a late-night conversation between Dr. Morgan and an unknown party on the phone. His voice, usually so smooth and confident, was hushed and urgent. "I need more time," he hissed. "They're starting to ask questions. No, I haven't accessed the records yet. These things take time if you don't want to get caught." As dawn broke, casting long shadows through the ICU windows, Sarah finally received a response from Dr. Chen. "Meet me in the basement archive room. 30 minutes. Come alone." The journey to the basement felt like a descent into another world. The bustling activity of the upper floors gave way to an eerie silence, broken only by the hum of ancient fluorescent lights and the echo of Sarah's footsteps on the concrete floor. Dr. Chen was waiting for her, his usually impeccable appearance now disheveled, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. His hands shook slightly as he ran them through his thinning hair, a nervous tic Sarah had never noticed before. "Tell me everything," he said without preamble. As Sarah recounted her observations and suspicions, she watched Chen's face grow increasingly pale. When she finished, he slumped against a filing cabinet, looking suddenly old and vulnerable. "Oh God," he whispered. "What have I done?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Dr. Chen, what do you mean? What's going on?" Chen's eyes met hers, filled with a mixture of guilt and fear. "I was desperate, Sarah. The board was threatening to shut down the ICU if we couldn't maintain proper staffing levels. We were hemorrhaging money and I was facing personal financial ruin." He let out a bitter laugh. "Turns out, betting your life savings on a sure thing medical startup isn't so smart," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "When Dr. Morgan's application came across my desk, it seemed too good to be true. I didn't look too closely. I didn't want to. He offered to make it worth my while if I fast-tracked his hiring. I told myself it was just a referral bonus, but deep down, I knew." The implications of Chen's confession hit Sarah like a physical blow. Their desperation, their need for a miracle, had blinded them to the wolf they had invited into their midst, and now, that wolf was loose among the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. As the gravity of the situation settled over them, a noise from the corridor outside froze them in place. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching the archive room. Sarah and Chen exchanged a look of panic as the door handle began to turn. The door creaked open, revealing a silhouette that sent ice through Sarah's veins. Dr. Morgan stood in the doorway, his usual charming smile replaced by a cold, calculating stare. The facade had finally cracked completely, revealing the predator beneath. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice dripping with menace. "I had a feeling you'd be down here, Nurse Lawson. Always so observant." His gaze shifted to Dr. Chen, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "And you, Michael. I'm disappointed. I thought we had an understanding." Sarah's mind raced, searching for a way out of this nightmare. She edged closer to a shelf of heavy binders, her fingers closing around the spine of one. If it came down to it, she'd fight her way out. "Who are you really?" Shish demanded, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "What do you want?" Morgan's laugh was hollow, devoid of any real mirth. "Who am I? I'm whoever I need to be, my dear. Today, a doctor. Tomorrow, who knows? As for what I want..." His eyes gleamed with a predatory light. "Information is the new currency, Sarah. And hospitals? They're gold mines." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Patient records, social security numbers, insurance information, all ripe for the taking in a busy ICU where an overworked staff might overlook a few anomalies in the system. "You won't get away with this," Chen found his voice, though it quavered with fear. "We'll expose you." Morgan's smile widened, revealing teeth that suddenly seemed too sharp, too predatory. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, Michael, you're as deep in this as I am. Who do you think they'll blame when it all comes out? The phantom doctor with no real identity, or the administrator who hired him without proper vetting?" Chen's face crumpled as the truth of Morgan's words hit home. They were trapped, caught in a web of desperation and deceit of their own making, but Sarah wasn't ready to give up. As Morgan took a step towards them, she made her move. The heavy binder flew from her hands, catching him square in the face. In the moment of confusion that followed, Sarah grabbed Chen's arm and bolted for the door. They raced through the dim corridors of the basement, the sound of Morgan's enraged shouts echoing behind them. The elevator was too risky. They headed for the stairs, taking them two at a time in their desperation to reach the upper floors, to reach safety and witnesses. As they burst into the bustling main floor of the hospital, Sarah's mind whirled with the enormity of what they faced. They had invited a wolf into their flock, and now they had to find a way to cage it before it was too late. The race against time had begun, with lives and identities hanging in the balance. The intensive care unit, once a place of healing, had become a battleground, and Sarah knew that before this nightmare ended, the very foundations of trust and safety in their hospital would be shaken to the core. The hospital corridors became a labyrinth of fear as Sarah and Dr. Chen raced through them, the sound of their ragged breathing mingling with the steady beep of medical equipment. Behind them, closing in with predatory patience, came Dr. Morgan, or whatever his real name was. They burst into the ICU, startling the night shift staff. "Lock down the patient records," Sarah gasped, her eyes wild with urgency. "Now!" Confusion rippled through the room, but years of emergency drills kicked in. Nurses moved swiftly to secure computer terminals and physical files. Sarah's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. They needed evidence, something concrete to prove Morgan's deception before he could cover his tracks or escape. A commotion at the ICU entrance drew everyone's attention. Morgan stood there, his usual immaculate appearance now disheveled, a trickle of blood running from his nose where the binder had struck him. But it was his eyes that sent a chill through the room, cold, calculating, and filled with a fury that stripped away any remaining pretense of the caring doctor he'd pretended to be. "Step aside," he snarled, advancing into the unit. "This is a misunderstanding that Dr. Chen and Nurse Lawson will regret." But the staff, sensing the wrongness in the air, formed a human barrier. They might not understand what was happening, but they trusted Sarah, had worked alongside her for years. Morgan's charm, so effective in isolation, crumbled in the face of true camaraderie. Seizing the moment, Sarah ducked into the medication room. Her fingers flew over the keypad, accessing the automated dispensing system. There, in the digital log, she found what she was looking for: a record of unauthorized access, of drugs being checked out in quantities that didn't match patient charts. "Chen," she called out, "call security and the police. We've got him." Morgan's composure cracked. In a desperate lunge, he shoved past the startled nurses, making a break for the emergency stairs. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized his goal. The hospital's server room was just 2 floors down, housing all the patient data he'd come to steal. Without thinking, she gave chase. The stairwell echoed with their footsteps, a dizzying spiral of metal and concrete. Sarah's legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't let him reach those servers. Everything they'd worked for, all the trust their patients placed in them, hung in the balance. She burst through the server room door seconds after Morgan, finding him already prying open a cabinet, a small hard drive in his hand. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Sarah saw something she hadn't expected: fear. The mask of the confident imposter was gone, leaving only a cornered criminal desperate for escape. "It's over," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her gasping breaths. "You've lost." Morgan's face contorted with rage. He lunged at her, the hard drive raised like a weapon. Sarah braced herself for the impact, knowing that this final confrontation would determine not just her fate, but the safety of every patient in their care. The clash was brief, but violent. Sarah, running on adrenaline and righteous anger, managed to deflect Morgan's wild swing. The hard drive clattered to the floor, skidding across the polished tiles. They grappled, a desperate struggle in the eerie blue glow of the server lights. Morgan was stronger, fueled by the panic of a man about to lose everything. But Sarah had something he didn't: a lifetime of caring for others, of placing her patients' needs above her own. She fought not just for herself, but for every vulnerable life that had been placed in jeopardy by this imposter's greed. A knee to the groin, a well-placed elbow, and suddenly Morgan was on the ground, gasping. Sarah pinned him, her forearm pressed against his throat. "Who are you?" she demanded. "Who sent you?" Morgan's laughter was a choked, bitter sound. "You think I'm the only one? Hospitals all over the country, overworked, understaffed. You're all so desperate for help that you don't look too closely at a miracle when it arrives." The truth of his words hit Sarah like a physical blow. How many other facilities had been infiltrated? How much data had already been stolen? How many lives potentially ruined? The door burst open, security guards and police flooding in. As Morgan was hauled to his feet and cuffed, Sarah felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. It was over, but the implications of what had happened were just beginning to unfold. In the days that followed, the full extent of the deception came to light. Morgan, whose real name turned out to be Eric Daniels, was part of a sophisticated ring of identity thieves targeting healthcare institutions. The potential damage was staggering, but thanks to Sarah's quick action, the worst had been prevented at Oak Ridge Memorial. Dr. Chen's role in the scandal sent shockwaves through the hospital administration. His initial resignation was rejected. Instead, he faced a disciplinary hearing. In a twist that surprised many, Chen chose to cooperate fully with the investigation, providing crucial information that helped authorities uncover similar schemes at other hospitals. Ultimately, Chen was allowed to retire early, his pension reduced but not eliminated, a controversial decision that recognized both his lapse in judgment and his eventual cooperation. His fall from grace served as a stark reminder of how even the most well-intentioned individuals could be led astray by desperation and greed. Sarah found herself thrust into a leadership role, tasked with rebuilding trust and implementing new security measures. As she stood before the hospital board, outlining plans to prevent future infiltrations, Sarah reflected on the nightmare they'd endured. The ICU, once a place of healing, had been violated in the most fundamental way. But as she looked at her team, saw the determination in their eyes, she knew they would emerge stronger. "We were victimized because we cared too much," she told the board. "We wanted so badly to help that we became vulnerable. But caring isn't our weakness, it's our strength. We'll use that same dedication to protect our patients, to be vigilant without losing our compassion." As she finished her presentation, Sarah felt a shift in the air. The fear and doubt that had plagued them were giving way to a new resolve. They had stared into the face of a nightmare and emerged victorious, and in doing so, they had reaffirmed the sacred trust between healer and patient. The intensive care unit would always face challenges, always walk the line between life and death. But now they were prepared for a new kind of threat, one that preyed on their best intentions. The imposter had been unmasked, and in his defeat, they had discovered a resilience they never knew they possessed. As Sarah left the boardroom, she allowed herself a small smile. The nightmare was over, but the vigilance would never end. In the world of healthcare, where every breath could be your last, trust was as vital as any medicine. And she would guard that trust with everything she had. Subscribe for more chilling tales from the Nightmare Maestro.